and welcome back to another episode of Making a Difference in Mental Health. I'm your host, Danielle Young.
And I'm your co-host, Wendy Grier.
And today we have a special guest, our colleague, Mr. Marty Caldwell, who happens to be a therapist with Advanced Behavioral Health. And we are going to have a really interesting conversation today. Don't you think, Wendy?
Oh, yes. We've been looking forward to this conversation, maybe for about a year, Danielle. Remember, we've talked about this subject matter. So we're going to take a deep dive into clinical work and race, actually. And so we found Marty, our brave soul, who wanted to come onto the podcast and speak truth about his caseload and how he works with particularly women, but particularly women of color.
Right.
And so we have really fascinating questions to ask Marty, and we want to, have a great conversation about it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So we're going to go ahead and get started, Marty, with some of the questions. But before we do, actually, can you give us just a little bit more about you for our audience to get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. So, of course, my name's Marty. I've been at ABH for almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years come June. And I'm pretty much just a person who wanted to be a therapist since a teenager, and I just went full throttle throughout undergrad and then grad school, and then I got into ABH right after grad school. Was very, very fortunate and privileged to have that experience. And everything was just threw me right in. Mm-hmm. And we've been riding the waves ever since.
That's right. Yeah. I have to say that I really enjoy sometimes when we do talk, or when we sometimes have our consults with each other. I enjoy Marty's perspective, and I think that's another reason why we invited you here today, specifically for this conversation and your take on working with clients, women and women of color. So I'm ready for this conversation. So I guess we're going to go ahead and start with the questions.
So we're going to get right into it. So Marty, are there differences in working with people of color from your perspective?
Absolutely. So I think one thing, and I know the topic of this podcast is kind of what the experience or perspective of a white/Caucasian therapist working with people of color is. And sometimes people go into working with people of color and they say, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. And I cringe so hard whenever I see somebody do that, just because that's not, you have to recognize what the differences are, because they're going to have a different experience than you. They're going to have so many other issues that you can't relate to just because of the color of your skin, or even just where you're from sometimes. So I think, if you acknowledge that in front of the client, I find that often puts them at ease right there. So they're like, okay, so there's the elephant in the room, it's addressed.
Yes.
He's not going to shove it under the rug.
Is that something you do in the beginning when you first meet a client, that you just get that elephant out of the way by saying, what do you say? Give us an example.
So I think, usually it comes up early on, but sometimes, if there's maybe a crisis or something, it may not be the first thing to acknowledge, and sometimes it comes up. But say if I'm talking to a teenager, say an African-American teenager, a teenage girl, since I have quite a lot of that demographic on my caseload, it might come up that they're talking about maybe family roles or, relationships, and I'll come up and be like, hey, listen, just so you know, I'm going to acknowledge that, you are a black woman and I am a white man, so our experiences are very, very different, so I'm going to approach this the best I can, and please feel free to correct me if I don't have anything right, but I'm still going to do the best I can to work with that. And generally speaking, that's really all you need to say. So you just don't make presumptions. You give them the space to talk about it, but also the space to acknowledge what the difference is in the first place.
So do you find that puts your clients at ease, and do they make any comments about it?
I have not had any clients make any comments about it before. 5 years seems like a long time, but it's not that long, so it could come up in the future. But generally speaking, the at ease part is definitely true.
Mm-hmm. I like that, Marty. I like that you just, dive in head first. Let's get it, out of the way, off the table, so that then you can really do some work and really engage with your clients. What do you think, Danielle?
I like Marty's approach. I know, speaking of, if you're working with someone who is either a different race or a different gender, I know a lot of times for myself, if I'm working with males, whether they be black, male, or African American, Caucasian, whatever the race, I always express to the client, I myself will not have the male experience. I identify as female, I identify as woman, and whatever the person identifies as, especially if it's the male gender, I'll say for myself, I won't have that particular experience. So I'm open to learn for you to kind of express your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, and your experiences. And then we can kind of journey through how we can work through managing those things and functioning on a daily basis. So I like that approach, and I think it's applicable for all of us.
Absolutely. Like reaching out and having that conversation and saying, please teach me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that puts a lot of people at ease and, gives you some authenticity to your work, because as you said in the beginning, I cringe when people say colorblind. I do too. I think that's the worst thing that you could say to anybody, that you're basically saying, I just don't see you at all. So that's my take on it.
Mm-hmm. And so, Marty, we want to kind of get a little bit deeper. We've talked about race. Now, when it comes to gender, how do you address your gender differences? Or you kind of talked about that. Can you expand just a little bit more?
It's basically the same thing in a lot of sense, just acknowledge, like, I'm a man, you're a woman, our experiences are going to be very different. I don't know, as a man, I have to deal with less than you in society, acknowledging that. And then again, it gives them the space to kind of talk about that. And I guess overall, one thing that helps me, and I think this is kind of what helps me build rapport very quickly, it especially works with like teenagers and young adults in particular, is like our goal is to be professional, but you can't be like overly professional, if that makes sense. Like if you take on like I'm the expert, I know everything, they're not going to listen to you. They get that all the time from their parents. They get that all the time from like maybe teachers or professors. Like they don't want to hear that. So if you break that down a little bit and like kind of put yourself closer to their level, then you're really setting them again at ease. So I think that just admitting that you're not an expert in the female experience, or if you're woman presenting the male presenting experience, or or maybe the LGBTQ experience if you're cisgendered or heterosexual. It's just acknowledging that you're different can really just level the playing field a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think also, like you said, acknowledging the differences will get you a little bit further and less resistance. And also, I feel like sometimes our clients feel that you're more real. Sometimes,
Exactly.
I mean, of course, we're professional, but there's a realness and an authenticity to, hey, I really am here to listen, to learn, and to help you get back to a space where you feel you can function on a daily basis and feel like truly, authentically good with yourself. So, yeah, that's really good, Marty.
Yep, absolutely. So, Mart, you talked a little bit about, how you're engaging with your clients. So I'm curious to know, do you ever come across resistance, number one? And number two, do you ever feel intimidated?
Resistance comes usually when there's some type of sexual trauma in female clients, particularly. And this could happen across, the same race, different races. And that makes perfect sense. If they were sexually assaulted by a man, then naturally they're going to be very hesitant to give that information to another male, in which case, usually I find it's best practice to refer them to a female therapist at that point so they can progress. And oftentimes the teenager, usually it's a teenager in this sense, they will admit like, hey, I've been withholding this from you because I'm not comfortable with you being a man. And that's another thing you ask, like, hey, this is a tough subject matter. Acknowledge the difference, and you say, like, is this something that you would feel comfortable talking to me about? Is this something you would want to speak to a woman about in this case? That's probably the most egregious example of resistance. I can't think of anything other than that. When I think of my own resistance, it usually comes if I'm being completely candid and honest, it usually comes from a client or family that has requested a therapist of a certain demographic of which I do not identify with. For example, right. So if they are requesting specifically an African American male therapist, I fit the male therapist part. I do not fit the African American part. And as you guys all know, us male therapists are like unicorns sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, there are like 3 of us in the office. So
Commodity.
Right.
Mhm.
But so at that point, the family has to decide. It can be up to the family. Do I value having the male component? Do I value the African American experience more? And it depends on the family. Some families they'll usually be like, we just want a man, period. It would help if you could relate to this experience, but we'll take what we can get. And then you do the same rapport building strategies I had already talked about. And that's a case where you would definitely want to acknowledge that difference early on.
And I have to admit, Marty, that in those kind of circumstances and examples, what tends to happen next is that your skills take over, and your clients don't even think about that anymore. I mean, they don't even worry about you're not a black male or you're a male. None of that. It all goes out the window. So it does speak to your skill set, and it does speak to your approach to every client that you deal with. So kudos to you, Marty, for that.
Thank you.
So, Marty, another question that we have for you, and that maybe some of the audience members who are also clinicians, whether it be therapists or counselors, what do you find in this particular instance for this topic? What modality or what form of practice do you find that is best for this particular population?
I find, because you want so much to come from the client, and this is something I apply across anybody who's old enough for it, is just motivational interviewing, generic thought exploration, thought challenging in particular. Thought challenging comes, once you have the rapport. So a really good example I could think of where motivational interviewing and thought challenging really came up was with a client I'd been working with for 3 or 4 years, and I was really trying to challenge her behavior towards like phone use and how it was interfering with her relationship with family members and school. So what I did is I did some prep work. I said, hey, I'm going to ask you a question that is probably going to put you on the defensive. So it was a why question. Everyone gets defensive when you start a question with the word why. And so like now some people are just used to it, but when you have like this older Caucasian man questioning you and you're a younger African American female, I would get defensive is what I would imagine. So I can only imagine what she was feeling. So I did some prep work for that. And then I asked her, well, how did you feel after I asked that question? And she said, you're right, I did get defensive. How did you know I was going to get defensive? And I said, well, it's because I asked a why question. I would get defensive too.
That's really good. I mean, this is really food for thought for us as well. I know that when we're in school, we learn, or at least I know I learned, don't start out with a why question. Never ask why. So you find all of these different types of ways to ask the same question. How, or maybe what, or when did you feel such and such a way, and what did it make you feel? And you're trying to find all of these different ways to get to the answer that you really want. And then there are the times where you want to be able to get to a space, especially if you said you work with a client for 3 to 4 years. At this point, we build enough rapport where I'm going to try something new to get straight to the core of what the issue is. And let's see how we can work our way to a better space, to a better solution. I kind of want to veer off a little bit, Wendy.
Go ahead, Danielle, take it.
Okay, so we were talking about this topic, and I wanted to, I had a little bit of a theory, and Wendy and I talked about the theory about how you work so well with women of color, specifically African American women. And I wondered if you've ever experienced this, where maybe for a specific client's case, maybe the representation of men in their lives have not reached their expectation, and maybe you've experienced resistance at first as a male therapist entering into this person's life to help them talk about and dissect some of the challenges in their life, whether it be family, personal, work, financial, relational. And do you find that you being consistent as a male therapist, but being a male in their life, opens them up a little bit more to be less resistant because you represent at least a positive male figure in their life? I know that was kind of a long question, but basically I'm saying, like, do you find that there may be an exchange that, okay, well, this is a representation of a male who has my best interest professionally, but has my best interest in mind. And so I feel
right, and I'm not used to that.
And I'm not used to it.
He shows up every week, no matter what I disclose, what I don't disclose, what we talk, but he's there every week. Consistent, more consistent than a male that should be in their life.
Has that ever happened at all? Because that was a thought that I had. Maybe you represent, or maybe there's an exchange. I'll give you information. I'll open up a little bit more because at least there is a male figure who has my best interest in mind, professionally though, but they are consistent, as Wendy said. Hopefully that made sense.
Oh, it made perfect sense, and I actually can tell you there's like multiple cases where that is the case.
Perfect.
So like my wheels are already turning. I saw one of them like a couple hours ago. So one thing you'll find, and this is true across multiple demographics, is that a majority of my caseload, the father isn't present, or the father of my clients are just not there. I can probably count the amount of families I have where there is a father figure present consistently on one hand. So a lot of these kids have this perception of, men are not going to stay. They're not going to be consistent. That is just one factor. Then you factor in the single mom factor. Single moms are, a lot of these times, these are young women, not that much older from, ourselves. And they might have had several boyfriends that just didn't go well. Whether that's on mom or the boyfriends, I don't know. That depends on case to case. So that's example 2. Men don't stay in my life. Men don't stick around. Men of this demographic, because kids will generalize, don't stay around. Men that are like this act this way. Mom said men who are like this act another way.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of it's a position you have to be very, very cautious with. Of course, we're caretakers, we're professionals, we're supposed to be working in the best interest of our clients. But this is an opportunity for male therapists to really shine through and just be as professional and also as real with them as they can be, just to show, like you guys said, I'm here to stay. I'm here with your best interest. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to leave you just because X, Y, and Z happened. I'm not going to judge you for anything, whether that's skin tone, whether that's what you say to me, that sort of thing. And now the reason you have to be cautious with that is because I've heard some of these stories where they had another therapist, or maybe it was like a doctor, who was supposed to fulfill a similar role, and they'll like kind of like vent about them, like, this person wasn't any good. This person, tried to get to know me, but they didn't really understand. So that can damage it. So as a clinician, you got to be really careful. It's like, that perception is in your hands, and you have to handle it very carefully.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I just, as we were preparing for the podcast today, it's just one of those things that you wonder. And, even us talking about this, Wendy and I have talked about this a lot. This is a topic that maybe is, maybe it does happen, but I've not quite heard it been put out or, discussed in this way. So, that question that I had, or that theory that I had, I think that you kind of talked it out and let us know that it's more common than not,
right,
with certain demographics and populations.
Right. I mean, I would add to that. Again, I've not heard this discussed, and race has been a big deal over the last 2 years, and we're a company that's very diverse. So we really wanted to give it space and a platform so that someone could really hear how successful you have been with women, and then particularly women of color, in your practice, and hopefully take something away from what you're giving us knowledge, Marty. You're sharing your 5 years of experience and your 5 years of work with this demographic. And so I'd like to just kind of go to the side for a minute and just talk about cultural humility. What does that mean to you?
I think it's similar to what I said before. It's just like acknowledging differences and just acknowledge, just like owning that. in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And, I will say this, I do have, the clinical experience under my belt. I have my own life experiences under my belt. I was fortunate to go to, all, completely diverse. I think the only non-diverse experience I had in my life was actually undergrad. High school was very diverse. Grad school was extremely diverse, of course. But, I had all these experiences. Parents raised me very, very well. They were very, in tune with differences and things like that. So, I can't, I'd like to say like, oh yeah, it's because of all the experience I have, but no, it's way more than that. I had a lot of factors going for me there that a lot of, maybe other white therapists do not have. So I think another perspective is like when you are put into positions like that, there's going to be many learning experiences that you have to look at as learning experiences. So if a person makes a mistake, for example, they say the wrong thing or they say something presumptuous or they, draw a wrong conclusion, then culture of humility would be like, take this as a learning experience as opposed to, well, it doesn't matter, or I'm colorblind, or you don't actually see it as a mistake.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like your diverse experience through your education has kind of built you or put you in a position where you're just a little bit more comfortable than maybe the average white clinician and white male clinician would be. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And even with the conversation, Marty, I even feel a sort of comfort in even asking these questions from this particular perspective, because again, we've not maybe heard this type of conversation before, and your transparency and even the comfort in talking about this, whereas, maybe other white clinicians might approach it very timidly. I think that your experiences, your interactions and exchanges with many diverse people, your graduate school experiences, as well as your list of clients, affords you this ability to be able to kind of just openly express how you feel. And I think you're also giving us, as clinicians of color, persons of color, a look at, what clinicians who are white or who are male may even think, say, or feel, or maybe have not had the opportunity to think, say, or feel until now.
Right. Or, what you can bring to the table. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just, expands our ability to learn and appreciate each other, regardless of race, the techniques and, who we're working for. And I think that is also what you and I had talked about, and we wanted to hopefully portray and get across in this podcast for our listeners. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that, Marty.
I'm happy to have the opportunity.
Yeah. So Marty, listen, before we go, because we're about to wrap up, what advice would you give or what tips would you give to other clinicians who are working with different ethnicities, different genders, those of different backgrounds? What advice would you give for our listeners?
I think I would give them the same advice you give anybody in some type of allyship training of any popularity, which is just do your homework, never stop learning. There's so many stories to hear. You keep your eyes peeled for the news. You keep, you listen to your colleagues that might be of color. You listen to your clients of color. If there's diversity trainings, attend them. That was a huge thing for me in grad school. Was my second internship. There was so many diversity trainings, and I went to as many of them as I possibly could, just because the school I was interning at was just there was like no majority.
Okay. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I love it. I love it. I'm actually taking notes. Educate yourself. Do the diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. Have some allyship trainings, and just never stop learning. Marty, I really like that.
Yes, and to have those conversations. This might have been a tough conversation, and for different people, but you made it easy, and I hope we made it easy for you to be open and have this conversation, because we need to be having more of these conversations, hearing perspectives from everybody in terms of mental health and the work that we do with people. So I like it.
I do
like it, Marty.
I do too. So Marty, we want to thank you so much again for your time. We hope that you enjoyed yourself. I know that we enjoyed this conversation.
I did. Again, like I said, it was my pleasure was all mine.
My name is Danielle Young with my co-host
Wendy Grier.
This is Making a Difference in Mental Health. We're always striving to make a difference in mental health. We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.